Hey everyone, welcome back to your favorite sales podcast. I'm your host, Ross Rich, and today we have a very special guest. We have Chris Calkin, who is the head of revenue at Census. So, yeah, thanks, Chris, for taking some time with us today.
Yeah, happy to be here, Russ.
Awesome, man. Well, before we get into it, we have some great topics and takeaways to dig into. But before we get in, Chris, would love to hear a bit about your story and how you became, head of revenue at this great company, Census, and kind of how you found your way through, revenue leadership.
Yeah, no, it's a funny question because you can start wherever, right? Like you could start with the things you're growing up, like being at lemonade stands or something, and how that's relevant. But
Yeah,
no,
any paper routes or
no paper routes, no paper routes. But in college, I was in business. I'd always been intrigued in business, and I was frustrated by a lot of the majors because it was like, cool, you can do accounting. And it's like, then you're only doing accounting. And I really realized like, I like all of it, but I don't want to have to do one thing. And so there was
Mhm.
this entrepreneurship major. And it was like, allowed me to kind of do everything. Which at first I thought would be great for consulting. Consulting would be like, I'd get to work with a lot of companies and kind of advise them across the board.
Mhm.
And then, I was in college during the recession. And so all of the jobs are like, uh, free internships to do cold calling, right? So
Perfect.
I was doing that and I was pretty good. And mostly it was because I had just genuine curiosity about companies' businesses. And so I kind of started to connect the dots between like, okay, wow, entrepreneurship and sales is actually fairly similar. I've
Mhm.
also always loved control over my own destiny, which is, I think, a reason why a lot of people get into sales, and realized I would have that in a real way in a sales career. I knew I wanted it to be for a startup though, so I joined a 30-person bootstrap startup in Seattle out of college. I was good at first, but certainly not great. I didn't have a ton of coaching, and actually, I thought that was probably good for me because I made a lot of mistakes.
Mhm.
But I did learn from the mistakes. Organization, as soon as I got organized, that was a key change for me. Um,
Mhm.
and that enabled me to start getting in touch with kind of the right people and understanding how to do bigger deals and how to work cross functionally. So grew within that startup um, into leadership positions. Uh, Ended up going back to school for my MBA, kind of doubling down on getting kind of more overall business acumen.
Mhm.
And that helped me step into a leadership position at Circle CI. Circle CI is a DevOps company. When I joined, is just took their Series C, and helped grow that sales organization from about 5 account executives to about 70 global salespeople. Um, Ultimately had a great run, and then was looking for opportunity to lead the whole revenue function, not just the sales function.
Mhm.
And that's where kind of led me to Census.
Very cool. Um, what made you think that the MBA route after doing sales would help with that? Because that's really interesting. Find that you find a lot of people maybe discovering sales post MBA, but not
Yeah,
like, hey, I did the thing, the bootstrap company did that and then went into leadership. So I'm curious to hear kind of what that, rationale was and how that played out in the real world, in the
yeah,
field. Yeah.
yeah. It was a The decision was made up of a couple things, right? Like one, I had been with the first company I joined for about 5 years, and I kind of saw like, okay, I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to continue to advance here.
Hmm.
And like we'd already built something great, and I think it was time for something new. I wanted to live in Europe, and this was a good opportunity for me to do that. European MBAs are 1 year. So then I was like, what schools are the US going to actually recognize? And I was like, really, Oxford's top of the list, so that's why Oxford. And then I'm like, I wanted a diverse experience. I didn't want to just be surrounded by tech in San Francisco, right? Like
Yeah.
San Francisco can be a diverse city in a lot of ways that you define diversity, but it's not that diverse in terms of job function.
Hmm.
Versus like at Oxford, I was negotiating with doctors and lawyers and things like that, which was a very different experience. Why I did it career wise was giving myself time to reflect and think about what is actually important to me and what do I actually want to achieve. Because
Mhm.
I think in so much in a career, you can just caught up, especially in sales, you can just get caught up in like hitting your quota for the quarter and like getting to the next goal. And you don't think about bigger picture. And so for me, it was a little bit of that opportunity to sit back and think about bigger picture. Um, and like where my gaps were, like what I was not as good at. Things like why patience was important, why rushing to decisions wasn't important, why actually having a good financial understanding is important to being able to be a sales leader. Uh, and it's funny, some companies didn't value it at all, right? Some companies I would interview with and they would be like, yeah. But what's funny is my CRO at Circle, um, Jane Kim, she interviewed me and she asked me the same question you just asked me. And I'm like, well, Jane, you have a Stanford MBA, so I think you know the answer. Um, and and so it is meaningful, right? Like in career growth, it has been another kind of badge. Whatever people think about an MBA, I had a great experience, obviously from a learning standpoint, but also just the freedom to be able to kind of look and think. And
Mhm.
I still worked during the whole thing, also. So, uh,
Totally.
you know, maybe I shouldn't have, but hard to not.
Yeah, completely. Well, I appreciate that. And yeah, it's interesting. I've worked with sales leaders that had that background and haven't. And I think my takeaway is just that framework level thinking. Kind of what you were saying is like stepping back and thinking about things outside of just the world that you've been in, if it's only been sales. So totally makes sense.
Right.
Well, appreciate that, Chris. Well, let's switch gears to kind of the three topics that we're going to dig into today. When we asked you to share these and I saw them, was stoked because I think, yeah, a lot of these fill into what I think is really important for sales, both at the cultural strategic level, as well as a couple of the more tactical things. So maybe starting at the cultural level, you want to walk us through kind of what you were thinking in terms of, every team member understanding and owning their output. Like it kind of goes back to what you said of why I went into sales and a lot of people did is owning your destiny, right?
Sure.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
So I mean, I think especially so. My experience is primarily in technology startups, right? Uh, the profile that a lot of people hire for sales is one that is focused on what is my quota, how am I going to achieve it.
Hmm.
There has to be this drive and this internal measurement that folks have in order for them to kind of reach that highest level of performance. Otherwise, they're just reaching for something that is kind of ambiguous and ultimately they won't know if they are successful or they're not. And so because of that, they won't be. Um,
Hmm.
so they need that. That said, if you hire for people that are just like I always think in an interview, like if they're asking what's the quota, what's the average W2, what's average rep performance, I'm like, okay, that's actually not anything relevant about my company. And so like if you aren't thinking of more critically about um, how you're going to achieve that, what tools you're going to have in place to be able to do it, and actually how you can improve that organization, then it's really hard to hire that type of profile early. Like
Hmm.
the type of profile early on has to bring something back. You don't have, you're not Salesforce, right? Like you don't have probably thousands of sales managers to like interpret what their team is saying, go make better operational processes, go do better documentation, change sales methodologies. Like that has to come from every single team member you hire. So even like, I just hired an SDR in London. And I'm really excited about her because I think she's going to really help us improve our copy overall as a company.
Mm.
Um, so I'm not like, I just want you to call and follow the script. I have a script. I have messaging. Do I think it should be better? Yes. Do I have the time to be doing it? Not necessarily. And am I going to be doing the cold calls? No. So if she's doing those cold calls and just like, not working, it's not working, it's not working, the feedback loop from me going, ooh, I need to change the call script is going to be much slower if she isn't like, hey, I did these 5 calls. This one worked best. Why don't we
Mm.
do this a little bit more? And so I really push every one of my team members to provide inputs, not just their output. Um, the other thing on the inputs is like I will give projects to my team as well as their close one, right? Like they'll be like, well, why don't we do more outreach towards opportunities that are lost? And I'm like, we should. Like, you could do that individually. While you do it individually, you're going to build out a process. That process, why don't we document it? Why don't we have that be consistent? And that's something that one of my account executives actually just finished up, who's fairly new to the organization, right? So is it a distraction for him? No, because he's doing that work. I'm not asking people to do work that is not directly benefiting them.
Hmm.
But ultimately, I am asking for them to take the work and to not just have it benefit them, but have it benefit the entire company.
And how do you think about identifying the right people that can both do the core job, right? Be hungry in terms of their take home and hitting goals and be competitive, like you need to be, especially at a high growth startup that doesn't have the messaging and everything perfect, and contributing back to the team. Because in my experience,
Yeah,
folks, and you want a diverse team in terms of people that kind of lean more into that and not. And how do you think about, like the upward trajectory of certain people and the balance between those two, right? Because I think typically the latter, the people that are putting things back to the team, move up to management and other roles. And does that seem fair to the reps that just like, I want to make sure we hit our quota? I'm curious to get your take on kind of the balance between those two aspects.
yeah. I mean, I think that early on, I'd say before 50 team members, every profile you need to hire needs to understand and walk in knowing that they could probably make more money somewhere else in a year,
Hmm.
but because they are at this organization, they will have more career growth and be more challenged and probably make more money in their entire career, right? Like even my first opportunity, right? Like I got 40K, like, and I was stoked to get 40K. And I had another opportunity that was 55K. And at the time, that was a big
It's a big
deal. That
delta.
was a huge
Yeah.
deal, right? Coming out of college, like I got to make some money. Um, there wasn't a doubt in my mind that I was going to take the 40K because I was like, this company is going to be way more fun to work at. I'm going to be way more excited and I'm going to grow way more.
Hmm.
And there's no chance, zero, that I'd be where I am in my career if it wasn't for making those decisions. And so I'm really hiring for people that want that same thing, that want the ability to grow, that want the ability to learn more than they just say, like, I am an expert at this. I'm going to come in and be a mercenary for you. Now, at 50, when you start needing a little bit less of those inputs and you've got the processes nailed in, then I think you can be okay hiring a little bit more of those mercenaries. At that point, that person can just focus on their output and you can kind of have a mutually good relationship.
Hmm.
But early on, I think that person will just get frustrated because they'll be like, I don't want to have to build all this stuff. Like,
Yeah.
why isn't this already here? And so it's really just about like, what are people's intentions? What are they interested in? And I've interviewed some great people that just aren't a good fit for where we are right now or where I have been at my previous startups. And then later I've been like, called them up and said, hey, what do you think now? Now that we're at, 100 million in ARR and we
Yeah.
have a 50-person sales team and we have 4 people on enablement, like, now I think we could do this.
Hmm.
Uh, I think it's just about stage and then what people are looking for.
Totally. Yeah. That's a good point. I used to think about it more objectively as like a person is a good seller. They can be successful at a big company, small company. I think people want certain things and expect certain, yeah, like I'm going to go in here and I'm going to do my sales thing versus I'm going to help build this organization and
Yeah,
contribute and have peers and all that kind of stuff. That's a great point. But shifting gears from like kind of the culture, strategy, kind of org building stuff to more tactical deal execution stuff. We got two topics here. One, which is really focusing on outcomes on calls with customers and
yeah,
being proactive around that. I think is definitely uh, unfortunately not the standard out there, but it's definitely a good best practice. And the second being around the end of it, which is focusing on go live dates and creating accountability for yourself and your customers. So maybe
yeah,
we start at the beginning and we'll hit the go live part at the end if that sounds good.
yeah, for sure. Do you want me to dive in a little bit to what I was thinking on the outcome side?
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool. So what I've found is that salespeople will, especially early on in their career, be very reactive, right? Customer comes in with requests to talk to you. You say, okay. And the worst that I've seen is like, great, hi, I'm here. I'm Census. Like, what do you want to talk about? That actually sometimes is better than like, hey, I'm Census, here's all of my things, and I'm just going to talk at you for a while. Um, but then it's like there's no going into the call preparing for an outcome. The customer might be like, ask a bunch of questions, they get their questions answered. The rep says, great, let me know if you have more questions. Maybe that person comes back, but they probably don't
Mm.
most of the time. Um, and I found that that's actually very common, right? Like without any sales structure, you'll find that approach. Then I think, like I said, that the other approach that I've seen is like customer does something,
Mm.
someone shows up, and then it's like, here's all of the things.
Yeah, overwhelmed.
So I
Yeah.
think, yeah. So I don't know if you've ever heard this, but this actually really bugs me, and it's really common. A lot of salespeople go like, okay, what is your unique strength? What is your superpower? And they're like, discovery. And I'm like, okay, what does that mean? Like, well, I just ask really good questions. And then I'm like, did the prospect show up to be asked questions? Like, no. Did the prospect show up to not have a tailored conversation? Also, no. Like, if you're going to do discovery, it has to be two-way.
Hmm.
So for me, the first thing that you do, even before the call, is you say, what is the outcome we want to achieve from this call? What is the outcome the customer probably wants to achieve from this call?
Yes.
And an outcome is not we completed a demo. It's not we went through pricing. Like that is not an outcome. An outcome is this customer is now in a place where they are ready to bring in technical stakeholders.
Yep.
And we have a demo next step secured to vet out whether a POC is worthwhile, right? Like that's the outcomes that I want to have. A customer's outcome might be like, I want to obtain information to determine whether this solution is worth investigating further, or I want to lock in a price to be able to move forward, a variety of things. And so then, like, most sales reps will do this. And they'll start with an agenda. In that, say, this is what we think you want to cover on the call. Can you tell
Hmm.
us, is that what you were looking for? What else might you be looking for? Great. We're definitely going to cover that. I'm also asking that if we do this and you believe that this is worthwhile, that we take this as a next step. And you do that up front. Because I know you and I
Yeah,
both
that's the
been on
outcome,
calls.
right? Yeah, that's
Right.
the actual outcome. An outcome isn't, like you said, hosting a meeting or hitting agenda items. People think that the outcome is doing the agenda. It's the thing that
Yeah,
happens next on both sides. Yeah, that's great.
exactly. It's like why you're selling, like the outcome, because people would be like, oh, well, what is the outcome of selling? You'd be like, a sale. And it's like, okay, well, there needs to be an outcome then for each
Yeah, all the
step of
micro
that sale.
sales. Yeah.
100%. And that's true for every call, right? Not just even sales calls. Like even if my SEs are on a call, it's like, what is the outcome that we want to achieve? Because otherwise, it's like you could have what usually will happen in a situation like that is you'll just have more calls.
Yeah.
The uh, yeah, the thing is, this seems like really really basic advice, but it's remarkable how infrequently it's actually done. Um,
Couldn't agree more, both as being a leader, but also being a buyer these days. I'm shocked
right.
at how they're just like either like the end of the spectrum is like, okay, here's what we do, here's everything, blah, blah, blah. Do you want this thing or not?
Right.
Or the opposite, which is like, okay, tell me whatever. I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, I took this, like, are you gonna guide me? And it's kind of in between, like you're saying, of like, okay, ask some thoughtful questions to make it custom, but also like, you're the expert. You're the person that lives this particular problem and solution. Like, you tell me.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I always tell people like there are calls that you can just do discovery. You can do one way. Like we have an opportunity with a large ticket company right now. And the first calls, usually the outcomes are like, they want to see if this is worth pursuing, and we want to ensure that they believe it is worth pursuing, and that we
Mhm.
want to secure a demo or we want to secure a technical POC. And you'd have that first call, you'd hopefully secure that. Then there's all this preparation that you'd want to do for the next call. And hopefully there is some champion that you have built that you can go like, hey, I want to do a great job for you and your team on this next call. Can we have 15 minutes so that I can ask you a few things to get some more details so that I can be really tailored for you.
Mhm.
I'm going to help you achieve your outcome if you help me achieve this outcome. Then go crazy, like ask the questions, because you've set the right precedent for that call. And then you can do all of your discovery and people will appreciate it because it's like, oh, they really want to know information, right? They
Mhm.
really want to be able to make this customized. Um, Again, it's seems obvious, not done that much.
Yeah, completely agree. And kind of on the back end of that, right? Thinking about outcomes, like the broader outcome is a customer being successful, picking a solution provider, partner, whatever you want to call it, and activating that, right? But I think a lot of people focus on just getting the deal done and don't have the same
Sure.
mindset as the customer, which is like, what's the outcome for them? They don't give a shit about the date that it's signed. They give a shit about the date that they're solving the problem, either to save
Right.
money or time or whatever the thing is. So curious to get your take on kind of how to orient reps on that side of things.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, reps are thinking about their quota and their quarter close, right? Like they're thinking, okay, I've got to get this deal in by January 31st because if I do, then I hit my quota, right? That is purely self-serving. Customers are not buying for you. Um, the only reason why they would care about what your perspective is because potentially they can use that as leverage for themselves to
Yeah.
get more from you. Um, and that is it, right? And that is why you usually see kind of the only urgency that people use is tied to discounting, is tied to terms, is tied to things that are like gives from the salesperson, which like I'm not saying you're never going to have to do, right? Like that is going to have happen sometimes just to move someone along, especially with procurement, right? Procurement sometimes will stand in the way, even if a party wants to go live and use a solution.
Mhm.
Um, so what does the customer actually care about? To your point, like the customer wants to have value from your technology. Otherwise, they're not talking to you. Otherwise, there is no point in your engagement. Like there is a pain that you are supposed to be resolving. And like that pain exists usually as soon as they start talking to you. Sometimes it's like a future planning. And we think this is going to exist in the future, but usually it already exists.
Mhm.
Um, and when that's the case, it's like, okay, what is preventing us from solving that today? Like, why not sign an agreement now to solve your pain? And then it's usually like, well, we have to get these stakeholders involved. Your technology is going to plug into this architecture. This architecture isn't ready for it yet. Like, there's all of these steps that you have to uncover on like why it's not just let's solve this pain today. Like why not sign a contract and we get going right now? And then you'd be like, okay, you come to this mutually understood date. And I actually like the idea. And I tell my reps, like, why aren't they just signing an agreement right this second? Like, if you don't know why that is, if you can't verbally tell me, then you haven't really had a good engagement with the customer yet.
Mhm.
Um, so then you establish this mutual date. For me, going through that process helps you. I call it like getting on the same side of the table as the client. Like,
Mhm.
obviously you have your adversarial relationship where it's I'm on this side of the desk, you're on this side of the
You
desk,
have the
and
money, I have the product. Yeah.
yeah, we're kind of passing the paper back and forth, right? But like what you really want to do is be, if you think about like a deposition or something, right? Like you want to be on the other side of the table, like passing the note to the person and being like, what do you think here? Do this.
Yeah. Working on it
Um,
together. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that happens when you do that collaboration on like how do we actually solve your pain together. Then you mutually establish a date. You hold to that date. Ideally, you're also establishing pricing and you're establishing scope. Um, and you hold to those components as well. That way, when you are when you're slipping in the evaluation, when something gets pushed back, you can say like, "We're going to miss this date. We need to be live by this date.
Yeah.
This is
And it needs to
if we don't
matter.
have this done." Yeah, yeah, it does. It can't be. It can't just matter to your quota. It has to matter to the client. Because otherwise, like they won't care, right? And again, sometimes it's like the client really needs to be live in March, and you want to close your quota in January, and okay, like maybe the client does do it for a discount. Then maybe they're like, cool, I'll do something a little uncomfortable so that I can get a better price.
Mhm.
those situations I think are going to happen just because it's two companies working together, that sometimes their priorities are not 100% perfectly in sync and timing is not perfectly in sync. Um, but I think especially the bigger company you are and the better salesperson you are, the more pipeline you have in place, the less you have to do that. Like, um, I think we were maybe talking on the last time you and I were talking, but like, uh, you've seen Tommy Boy.
Yes.
It's remarkable how many salespeople these days have not seen Tommy Boy. So, like, if anyone watches this, go watch that movie.
Yeah, if you take
But there's
anything out of
this,
this conversation.
go watch that movie. Uh, but like, he talks about having the pizza in the trunk. Like, when you aren't so urgent for yourself, that also comes across to the client, and it becomes more apparent that you have their interests in mind as you push.
Mhm.
Because urgency for yourself does show. Like, all of us experience that day to day when we interact with people. Why someone cares about something for themselves versus they're actually really thinking about what's best in it for the client. And
Mhm.
that's why if you don't have this date established with the customer, you're just going to be like, "Ooh, I'm not at my quota," and that's going to be your only urgency you can push.
Totally. And then I think it's Sandler or Miller Hyman. Some one of those frameworks I think have a great way of saying this, which is like the level 3 client pain. I hate the word pain in sales and all that kind of stuff, but basically like why to them, not just their company. And it kind of ties back to like what's the most motivating thing is for the rep to care about, not just the rep's company. The thing that's going to motivate your customer the most isn't going to be for the company, it's going to be for them personally and how it fits into the
Right.
company. I think that's what the best sellers do in terms of sitting on the same side of the table is like I'm going to figure out through working together and gaining your trust what you care about personally and how that fits
Yeah.
into a big enough problem with the company. And that's the date. And that's how we're going to talk about it because you're going to make those weekly meetings. You're going to make those introductions to those other stakeholders in a really positive way for me. You're going to do all these things. Yes, it's going to solve a company problem on your end, but it's because you're going to look really great and advocate for this
Yeah.
because of the trust that you gain and it's on the personal level. And I think that's such a sorely missed thing when we talk about ROI and, you know, all this stuff. It's like, why does this date matter to them personally is going to be the highest
Yeah.
motivating thing, just like your quote is going to be the most motivating thing for you as a seller.
Yeah. I do think one thing that's interesting, and I'm curious if you agree on this, but like, and maybe we were talking about this before. Still, even in the case where it's an individual motivation, like almost especially in the case where it's an individual motivation, pain avoidance or risk avoidance is still going to be more powerful than I look good. Like, if I'm neutral and then I would look good versus like I'm neutral and if I don't do it, I would look bad. People will always act to avoid bad. People will
Yes.
sometimes act if to look good. And usually it's like the right people. Finding the person that wants to look good is great because that can end up being like a really good champion for you, and they'll like
Mhm.
make waves in the organization and they're going to be more positive in working with you. And so like if you find that person, then really good. There is a that but like on the date, like holding to the date, if you talk about like the risk and the pain that will be experienced from missing it versus like the benefits that you get from it, I
Yes.
just think it's more powerful. It's even the same with quota, right? Like it's remarkable how many people achieve their quota or get to like within 99 to 101%. And it's like, why is that? Because they don't want to miss, not because they want to get to 150%. And they want to achieve the most possible. So
I agree on
it's
that. I
just
agree
funny how
on
that's the
avoiding
case.
making the mistakes. I completely agree with you. I think for more mature products and companies, that's an easier thing to sell into. I think for newer markets, I'm not sure if you had this experience as well, being at some early stage companies, it's really hard to make that case because it's not a known mistake, right? It's like, hey, we're going to do this new different thing, not because we're going to mess up with the status quo. That's why I think these kind of market maker type reps and sales leaders are so freaking rare and everyone wants to find them, right? Anyone with a Series A, Series B, Series C investment wants to find that market maker sales
Yeah.
organization revenue team because, like you said, you're almost avoiding like the 80% of the market who's going to make decisions from not making a mistake. And you're going to go and find these champions and these companies that are willing to do something better for the sake of it. And
Right.
I think that's why a lot of companies buy technology because they're forward thinking and, want to take those risks.
Yeah, I mean, for folks that haven't read Crossing the Chasm, right, I actually think it's a very relevant book for salespeople just to understand like
Completely.
why certain buyers buy at different stages of the organization. And then like also I even think about it from a persona standpoint. Like if you find the
Yes.
people with like when I think about the enterprises that I've won at earlier stage startups, it's because there is people within those
The
enterprises.
specific people. Exactly.
Yeah, like find, and that's why like technologies like that find people that have moved companies, things like that. Like that's why they're useful because it helps you be like, ooh, we have a large retail customer where the primary person came from one of our startups that worked with us early days, and like that made this conversation a lot easier. But I do also think, I guess the one other thing I'd say though is you're trying to create a pain that they didn't know existed before. So it's helping them realize that by doing this, they will make sure that they beat their competitors or they beat their profit margin goals or whatever it is. And that if they don't, their competitors will win
Yeah.
and that they will lose. It's like your business won't fall apart. You will just slowly die. That's a little less powerful than like you will crumble tomorrow or
An
like,
outage or security, why like Wiz is
right,
the company that, everyone's talking about and all this kind of stuff with acquisition is like,
right,
yeah, without this stuff, you could fail. So
right.
that avoidance is definitely more powerful. But before we wrap, one question, because I think not a lot of people would disagree with these topics, but the big question is the hard part is about doing this every day, right? How do you
Yeah.
consistently make sure your team is setting those next steps, focus on the outcomes? How do you consistently make sure your team is thinking about and sitting on the same side of the table? What have you found as cheat codes to operationalize this, right? So you've gone from doing it yourself to managing a team and coaching them super hands-on to now being, the head of revenue here. How do you build a culture and set the standard for this is the way we do things? And how do you make sure that the team is following this instead of as like we're talking about is like, oh, these companies aren't doing this stuff. How do you make sure you're the exception to that rule?
Yeah. That's the hard part. That is the hard part. I think it's part of why I like joining earlier stage companies is because I talk about it as like seeding influencers. Like you have the people that it's a small group early on where you're in the room, right? Whether that's remote or not, where everyone ends up doing more or less kind of the same process and building that process together, and they
Mhm.
become the foundation of your organization. And so by having it not just come from you tops down, but having it actually bottoms up from some of the first hires, could be SDRs, could be anybody. They help go, oh, well, they're a high performer. And usually people that are at companies longer in sales are usually better performers.
Mhm.
Um, they're doing this. I want to do that. When we record a gong call and they're going through onboarding and training, they see that. They see it in the playbooks.
Mhm.
They get it in their coaching. So it's just making sure it's surrounded all the time.
Yeah, repetition.
And
Yeah.
then and then it's also like I operationalize things sure with systems like Gong and Salesforce where like when I look at the macro level of opportunities, I see next steps and next step dates are the most important fields I look at. If I don't see a next step date in the future, it always has to be in the future. If it's in the past, then it's like, okay, so there isn't a next step. That next step came and went. And then the actual details of the text that's in the next step tell me like, what was the outcome that we achieved and what's the outcome we are looking for
Mhm.
next. Um, and those are ways that I have helped improve this, but it's not, I'm not 100%. I'm not batting 1,000.
Like you said, it's the hard
But
part. Yeah.
yes, it is the hard part. I mean, I guess on the components on the go live dates, like sure, you can have POC plans, you can have structured processes, you can have obviously sales training and sales playbooks, and we have all those things. Again, though, I think that the way is through seeding influencers early on, making it the default part of your sales decks, making it a default part of your materials,
Mhm.
and then trying to measure through a system, Gong, Salesforce, whatever, HubSpot, whatever you use.
Totally. No, I agree. I think that repetition from day one. Here's our culture. This is the standards. This is what a good call looks like. This is what you're expected from a playbook process, and then the inspection and the enforcement of that through. Do you have your go live plan that's aligned, actually signed off by the customer, not just that you made up and said that these are the dates? Do you have those next steps that hopefully are within the next few days of something that's actionable, that's also customer based activity versus just you following up as a next step?
Yeah.
Are great ways of kind of carrying forward that culture. But no, this was awesome, Chris. Appreciate you taking time out of your busy day and a quarter to connect and kind of share your learnings with the community here. So this was awesome.
Yeah. Happy to do it. Thanks a lot.
Of course. All right. Take it easy.
Appreciate it, Ross.